You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's a phrase I hear surprisingly often in coaching conversations with women leaders. It usually arrives somewhere in the middle of the discussion, not generally as the main issue, the reason that they booked the session, almost as a kind of an aside. They'll say something like, "I can't seem to switch off," or "my brain just never stops," or sometimes, "nothing is actually wrong, I just feel like I'm always on." And what strikes me is that they're rarely talking about being busy. Many of these women are highly capable. They're successful, they're respected, and some are leading organisations, some are leading teams, some are running their own businesses, some are holding demanding careers alongside families, ageing parents, community commitments, or sometimes even all three. They're not falling apart, they're functioning remarkably well. But something else is happening. The workday ends, the meetings finish, the laptop closes, and yet somehow the day doesn't quite feel finished. Part of them is still somewhere else, replaying a conversation, thinking about a decision, remembering something they forgot to do, anticipating a meeting tomorrow, wondering how a situation might unfold, mentally drafting an email they haven't written yet. The body has left work, but the mind hasn't. And what makes this difficult to talk about is that much of the thinking seems perfectly reasonable. It's not irrational. It's often useful. The decision does matter. The project is important. The relationship needs attention. The issue genuinely requires thought. So instead of questioning the pattern, women often assume this is simply what responsibility feels like. This is leadership. This is what happens when people rely on you. But over the years, I've become increasingly interested in a different question. Not why are women so busy, but why do some responsibilities continue occupying us long after the responsibility itself has passed? Why does the meeting keep running in our heads after we've left the room? Why do tomorrow's problems arrive before tomorrow does? And why can rest feel strangely difficult even when there's finally time for it? Because what I've noticed is that many women don't struggle with workload nearly as much as they struggle with carrying. Carrying decisions, carrying expectations, carrying possibilities, carrying people, carrying things that don't have an obvious finish point. And when we're carrying something internally, putting it down isn't as simple as closing the laptop or leaving the office. Today, I want to explore that invisible load. Not the work itself, but the responsibility that continues living inside us after the work is done. Because when you can't switch off, it may not be because you're doing too much. It may be because you're carrying more than you realise. One of the things I've noticed coaching women leaders is they rarely describe themselves as stressed. That's the language other people use. The women themselves usually describe something different. They talk about responsibility. They talk about being the person who remembers, the person who notices, the person who keeps track of what everyone else has forgotten. They talk about carrying the bigger picture, holding things together, thinking ahead, watching for problems before they become problems. And what's fascinating is that much of this work is invisible. Nobody sees it happening because it isn't occurring on a task list. It's happening in the background, quietly and constantly. A woman might be sitting at dinner with her family while simultaneously remembering an unfinished conversation from work, driving home while mentally preparing for a meeting next week, walking the dog while thinking about a team member she's worried about. Technically, she's resting, but part of her attention remains allocated elsewhere. And this is where I think we often confuse workload with mental load. Workload is visible. It's tasks, meetings, deadlines, projects. Mental load is different. Mental load is the ongoing management of responsibility. It's the remembering, the anticipating, the monitoring, the mental tabs left open. Some of those tabs are practical, some are emotional, some strategic, and some relational, but all of them consume attention. What makes this particularly difficult is that many of these habits began as strengths. Thinking ahead is useful, planning is useful, considering consequences is useful, paying attention to people is useful, reading situations accurately is useful. These are not deficiencies, they're leadership capabilities, which means the problem isn't the thinking itself. The problem emerges when the mind never receives the signal that it's safe to stop. When responsibility becomes continuous, when there's always one more thing to consider, one more possibility to prepare for, one more conversation to think about, one more outcome to manage, and eventually something subtle happens. Being mentally occupied starts to feel normal. The absence of mental occupation starts to feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable. I've worked with women who finally take a holiday after months of pushing really hard, and what surprises them isn't how tired they are, it's how difficult it is to settle. Because the workload stopped, but the carrying hasn't. The mind is still holding responsibility, still tracking, still preparing, still scanning. Not because something's wrong, but because carrying has become a way of staying connected to what matters. And here's the important thing. Not every woman carries responsibility in the same way. In season 1, we explored 4 leadership archetypes: the sovereign, the warrior, the wise woman, and the tribe builder. What interests me is that each of these archetypes carries a different kind of responsibility, which means each one struggles to switch off for different reasons. And once you understand what you're carrying, something becomes much easier to see, why your mind keeps returning to it. Let's start with the sovereign. If you listen to season 1, you'll remember the sovereign is motivated by autonomy, purpose, and authorship. She wants to lead her own life. She wants to make meaningful decisions. She wants to have an impact. And because of that, the sovereign often becomes the person carrying decisions. Not just making them, but carrying them. One of the things I've noticed working with senior women leaders is that the responsibility of decision-making rarely ends when the decision is made. The meeting finishes, everyone agrees on the direction, the action is allocated, the organisation moves forward. But internally, the sovereign often keeps thinking, did I miss anything? Have I considered all the implications? What happens if this doesn't work? How will this affect people 6 months from now? What unintended consequences might emerge? And what's fascinating is that this isn't indecisiveness. In fact, many of these women make decisions quite effectively. From the outside, they look clear, capable, and confident. The looping happens afterwards because the sovereign understands something important. Every decision closes one path and opens another. Every choice creates consequences. Every act of leadership affects people. So while others may move on once a decision is made, the sovereign often remains connected to it. She's still evaluating, still considering, still carrying responsibility for the outcome. I remember coaching a senior executive who said to me, I can make the decision, that's not the hard part. And then she paused. The hard part is carrying the consequences afterwards. I think many women will recognise that, not because they're uncertain, but because they care. The sovereign doesn't just carry tasks, she carries accountability. And accountability doesn't always have a neat endpoint. A project may finish, a decision may be implemented, but the responsibility for what follows can continue living quietly in the background. The mind keeps checking, reviewing, monitoring. Not because something's wrong, because leadership matters. And over time, that ongoing connection to responsibility can become exhausting. Not visibly exhausting, but internally exhausting. Because even when nothing requires action, part of the sovereign remains mentally available. She's still holding on to the bigger picture, still watching the horizon, still asking, what's next? And what have I not yet seen? The warrior carries something different. If the sovereign carries responsibility for direction, the warrior carries responsibility for action. The warrior is energised by achievement, by progress, by momentum, getting things done. She sees a challenge and she moves towards it. She sees an obstacle and she starts working out how to overcome it. She sees an opportunity and begins planning the next step. And these are extraordinary strengths. Many organisations depend on women with strong warrior energy. They're the women who make things happen. They keep projects moving, they turn ideas into reality, and they remain steady when pressure increases. But every strength has a cost when it never gets switched off. One thing I hear often from warrior women is, I can't stop thinking about what comes next. The current task isn't finished before they're already considering the next one. The meeting ends and they're preparing for tomorrow. The project launches and they're thinking about implementation. The report is submitted and they're already reviewing what could be improved next time. The mind stays in preparation mode, in readiness mode. And because readiness has often served them well throughout their lives, it can begin to feel responsible, useful, necessary. One client laughed as she described finally sitting down on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of tea. She said, I sat there for about 30 seconds before I started mentally reorganising next week. Not because she actively wanted to, but because her brain had become accustomed to scanning for the next challenge, the next requirement, the next obstacle, the next thing requiring her attention. What I find interesting about warrior mental load is that it often masquerades as productivity. People admire it, they certainly reward it, and they come to depend upon it. The woman herself usually feels proud of it for a while, until she notices she can no longer simply enjoy where she is, because part of her is always preparing for where she needs to be next. The body may be resting, but the mind remains poised for action. It's waiting, planning, anticipating, as though something important might happen at any moment. And eventually the question becomes, when does preparation become permanent? Because a mind that's always preparing never quite arrives in the present. The wise woman carries something different again. If the sovereign carries decisions and the warrior carries readiness, the wise woman carries influence. Not influence in the way we often imagine it, not necessarily charisma, visibility, not being the loudest person in the room. The wise woman understands something more subtle. She understands that outcomes rarely happen because of logic alone. People shape outcomes. Relationships shape outcomes. Trust shapes outcomes. Credibility shapes outcomes. Influence shapes outcomes. And because she sees those dynamics so clearly, she often keeps thinking about them long after everyone else has moved on. One of the things I've noticed coaching women leaders is how uncomfortable many of them are with acknowledging that influence matters to them. They'll happily tell me they want to help people. They want to contribute. They want to make a difference. They want their work to matter. But when we start talking about influence, many become noticeably less comfortable, as though influence is somehow selfish, as though power is something that good women should avoid wanting. And yet when we explore it more deeply, a different picture usually comes out. They don't want power over people. They want enough influence to make good things happen, enough influence to have their ideas heard, enough influence to advocate for something they believe in, enough influence to create change, enough influence to protect what matters. The wise woman understands that influence is not separate from impact. Influence is often how impact happens. And because she understands that, her mind naturally tracks things that other people often miss. The stakeholder who seems supportive but isn't fully committed. The conversation beneath the conversation. The relationship between two people that may affect a future decision. The shift in organisational mood. The emerging alliance. The unspoken concern. The political current running underneath the formal process. I once worked with a senior leader who said, "I wish I could stop analysing all of this." And then she laughed and said, "But every time I ignore it, it turns out to matter." I think many wise women will recognise that. Their minds are constantly joining dots. Not because they're suspicious, not because they're cynical, but because they're trying to understand how influence is moving through the system. And unlike a project plan or a task list, influence never sits still. Relationships evolve, stakeholders change, priorities shift, power moves, which means the wise woman can find herself carrying an endless stream of unfinished thinking, still making sense of a conversation from last week, still wondering how a decision will land with key stakeholders, still considering whether she's reading the situation accurately, still thinking about what hasn't yet been said. And eventually the question becomes, when does awareness become vigilance? Because the very capacity that allows the wise woman to navigate complexity so effectively can also make it difficult to rest. Not because she's worrying, because she's tracking. And influence, unlike a task, never reaches a neat point of completion. The tribe builder carries something else entirely. If the sovereign carries decisions, the warrior carries readiness, and the wise woman carries influence, the tribe builder carries people. Not in a formal sense, not necessarily on an organisational chart, and not because someone assigned it to her. She carries people because she notices them. She notices when someone seems quieter than usual. She notices the tension in a conversation. She notices when someone appears overwhelmed. She notices when a relationship feels strained. She notices who's being included and who isn't, who's coping and who might not be. Connection is her natural language. Belonging matters to her. Relationships matter to her. The emotional well-being of the people around her matters to her. And these are beautiful qualities. The tribe builders I work with are often extraordinary at creating environments where people feel seen, welcomed, valued, safe. People naturally confide in them. They trust them. They seek them out. And often they become the emotional glue holding teams, families, and communities together. But that gift comes with a particular kind of mental load. Because unlike projects, people also don't have completion dates. You don't tick off a relationship and move on. You don't finish caring about somebody. You don't complete belonging. One of the things I've noticed in coaching conversations is that tribe builders often struggle to identify exactly what they're carrying. When I ask what's occupying their attention, they rarely begin with themselves. Instead, they start talking about other people. a colleague who seems stressed, a team member who's struggling, a difficult conversation that didn't quite land properly, a family member they're worried about, someone who appeared upset, someone who may need support, someone they haven't checked in with recently. And often these concerns are entirely legitimate. Their observations are usually accurate. Their care is genuine. But the challenge is that care has no obvious boundary. There's always one more person who could use support, one more conversation worth having, one more relationship that would benefit from attention. I remember one woman describing waking up in the middle of the night, not thinking about her own workload, not worrying about her own challenges, but thinking about whether somebody else was okay, whether they were coping, whether she should reach out, whether she'd missed an opportunity to help. And what struck me wasn't how unusual that was, it was how familiar it sounded. I've heard versions of that story countless times. The tribe builder's mind often remains connected to people long after the interaction has ended. A conversation may be long over, but she's still wondering how it landed. The meeting's finished, but she's still thinking about the person who didn't say much. The disagreement may have been resolved, but she's still reflecting on how everyone involved might be feeling. And eventually something subtle begins to happen. Responsibility expands, not because anybody asked her to carry more, because she cares enough to notice more. The line between compassion and responsibility becomes blurred. The line between support and ownership becomes blurred. And without realising it, she begins carrying emotional weight that was never entirely hers to hold. Not because she's weak and she lacks boundaries, but because connection matters deeply to her. I think this is one of the reasons rest can feel surprisingly difficult for tribe builders. The people they care about don't disappear when the workday ends. The relationships don't pause. The concern doesn't automatically switch off. Part of them remains connected. They're still checking, they're still wandering, they're still caring. And unlike the warrior who's preparing for action or the wise woman who's tracking influence, the tribe builder is often carrying something much more personal. The well-being of other human beings. The question underneath it all is often beautifully simple. Are they okay? And because there's rarely complete certainty about the answer, the mind keeps returning to it, again and again. Not because something's wrong, but because caring has become entwined with responsibility. At this point in the episode, most listeners will have recognised themselves somewhere. Perhaps it's in the sovereign carrying decisions, or the warrior carrying readiness, maybe the wise woman carrying influence, or the tribe builder carrying people. And for some women, there'll be a little bit of all four. Because the truth is, very few of us carry only one kind of responsibility. What matters isn't which archetype fits best. What matters is recognising what continues living in your mind long after the moment has passed. One of the things I often notice in coaching conversations is how rarely women stop to ask themselves a very simple question. What am I actually carrying right now? Not what are you doing, not what needs your attention. What are you carrying? Because they're not always the same thing. A decision can be finished and still be carried. A project can be completed and still be carried. A relationship can be stable and still be carried. An issue can be resolved and still be carried. Sometimes we're holding things that no longer require action. They only require awareness. And sometimes we're holding things that were never ours to carry in the first place. I think there's value in becoming curious about that, simply noticing. When your mind returns to something repeatedly, ask yourself, what am I carrying here? Is it responsibility, influence, readiness, care? What part of me believes this still needs my attention? You don't need to change anything immediately. You don't need to let it go. You don't need to fix it. Just notice it. Because awareness often reveals things effort can't. And sometimes what we discover is surprising. The thing occupying our attention isn't actually the task itself, it's what the task represents. Responsibility, control, belonging, influence, care. Once we see that, the experience begins to soften, not because the situation changes, but because our relationship with it changes. One of the biggest misconceptions about rest is that it arrives when everything's finished. Most women listening already know that's not true, because there's always something unfinished. There's always another conversation, another decision, another project, another person, another possibility. Life doesn't pause neatly, and leadership certainly doesn't. So perhaps the question isn't, when will everything be done? Perhaps the better question is, can I allow myself to stop carrying it, even while it remains unfinished? I don't mean ignoring it, and I don't mean abandoning responsibility. I mean noticing the difference between being responsible for something and mentally holding it every minute of the day, because they're not the same thing. One of the reflections I often leave clients with is this. What would still happen if I stopped carrying this quite so tightly? Not stopped caring, stopped carrying. Sometimes the answer is nothing would change. Sometimes the answer is other people would step up. Sometimes the answer is I'm holding something that isn't actually mine. And occasionally the answer is I don't know, which is useful information too. Another reflection worth sitting with is what part of me feels safer when I keep thinking about this. Not because the answer's wrong, because it's often very revealing. The sovereign may discover she's carrying certainty. The warrior may discover she's carrying preparedness. The wise woman may discover she's carrying influence. The tribe builder may discover she's carrying connection. These aren't problems. They're deeply human needs. The question is simply whether carrying them continuously is serving you well or exhausting you. And perhaps the final reflection is this. When was the last time I felt genuinely at rest? Not distracted, not recovering, not collapsed from exhaustion. At rest. What was present? What wasn't? What conditions allowed that experience? Because rest isn't something we earn at the end of perfection. It's something we experience when the nervous system no longer believes it has to hold everything at once. If you'd like to explore some of these patterns more deeply, I've created a collection of free resources that accompany this season of the podcast. You'll find a link in the show notes. They're designed as gentle reflections and practical supports for women navigating leadership, responsibility, power, and well-being. You don't need to complete them all. Simply choose the one that speaks to where you are right now. Perhaps the reason you can't switch off has very little to do with switching off at all. Perhaps it's about carrying decisions, carrying readiness, carrying influence, carrying people, carrying things that matter. And if that's true, the invitation isn't to become less caring, less responsible, less thoughtful. The invitation is simply to notice what you're holding and to ask whether all of it needs to remain in your hands. Because leadership was never meant to be a form of permanent vigilance, and strength was never meant to mean carrying everything alone. The meeting ended, the project finished, the conversation happened. Tomorrow will arrive when it arrives. And perhaps tonight, for a few moments at least, you can allow yourself to put something down. Not forever, just long enough to remember that you are more than what you carry. Next episode, we're going to explore something many women recognise but rarely talk about. Those moments when you hear yourself speaking and think, that's not me. When leadership starts feeling unfamiliar, when patience becomes irritation, when confidence becomes withdrawal, when you don't quite recognise yourself in how you're showing up anymore. And we'll explore what those shifts might be trying to tell us. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.